Okay, so we're going to continue on with identifying and abusing escalation paths. So a couple areas here that can be exploited is abusing dynamic groups and abusing managed identities. So we're going to take a look at this reference link here on abusing dynamic groups. So this article here from Mnemonic Labs is about abusing dynamic groups in Azure AD for privilege escalation. So one of the interesting things you can do with this is some accounts that you can set up to dynamically add people. You can add like a specific keyword. So if you had someone from, I don't know, let's see what domain we could think of. So like you had someone actually from Apple that was collaborating with you on B2B, so you could set up where if any user IDs come in from Apple, that would automatically set up their account for them and add them to tenants. So, as we've mentioned before, Active Directory has different roles in Azure. So you manage security groups and manage users. And so here's a screenshot of some of these roles, some of these administrative roles. And of course, role-based access control, the governed infrastructure deployed within Azure. So the technique, abusing dynamic groups while researching and testing Azure deployments, the authors stumbled across an interesting privilege escalation vector, the abuse of dynamic groups in Azure. So what are dynamic groups? Dynamic groups in Azure AD allow administrators to automatically assign group membership to users based on attributes that the user, for example, if the company has 2 offices in Oslo and London, they may create a security groups for each of those offices. They can use dynamic groups based on the user city attribute for the purpose. So if you're an attacker, you knew some of these names, these cities, that you could exploit this. So they can use the dynamic groups based on the city attribute for the purpose of, so whenever a new user is added to Azure AD, they will automatically be added to one of these Azure groups. So the following picture shows how you would do this with the dynamic group rule. So here you can see that they're just adding in London for this one particular city. And so you can see the property city operator equals and value of London. This is part of the membership rule. So this use case is fairly innocent, but let's think a little more security sensitive. Okay, an organization creates a dynamic group called VM contributors, which has VM contributor access scope to the subscription. So here it goes, pay as you go access control. So here's the VM controllers group. Now the original the organization outsources all the VM management to a company called Bluefish, and Bluefish uses the following naming convention. So username bluefish.no is the domain name they use to automate the process of Bluefish users being added to VM contributors. A rule is added to dynamically add any user with Bluefish in the principal and the user principal name to the VM contributor group. Seems reasonably innocuous, since users cannot modify the UPN without appropriate access control, and the organizations has locked these down. So we can kind of see this rule here. The principal name includes Bluefish. So we can see this rule. So time to escalate some privileges. So let's assume our scenario that an adversary gains access to low privilege user in Azure AD, which resides in no groups or Azure roles-based rule-based access controls. So the compromised user has the global reader role, so the attacker can read the configuration directory, but cannot change the settings, and therefore cannot use traditional methods to access the rights to their own user or the tools. The attacker finds the dynamic membership rule, and I like the way they use attacker, that they're using this properly instead of using hacker in a negative connotation, and wants to find a trigger to the dynamic rule for an account they control. In short, the attacker needs to get the name Bluefish and the UPN attribute of their user. So we can see their account here, their profile. So since the users with global reader role cannot edit any configurations, the attacker cannot edit their own UPN and is stuck. Okay, user principal names are based on user email addresses. I have identified dynamic groups based on this attribute in the past, and on the surface seems okay because users generally cannot change their own email address. This requires administrative privileges within Azure AD, such as role as user administrator. However, there's a way around this, abusing guest accounts. So by default, users in AD can invite guest users to the directory. Since the UPN of a guest user is based on the email address, an adversary can simply create a new email address from any email address provider, such as Gmail, that contains Bluefish in the address. So it doesn't have to be from the Bluefish domain name. So here's the example here. We're just using a Gmail account and we're adding Bluefish to that. So the attacker invites this email to the attacker. If the attacker invites this email to the Azure tenant, so they get this invite. And so you see they're inviting the user, and it's got the Gmail account that we're using to exploit with, that they're using to exploit with. And they accept the invite, the user becomes a user in the local directory of the UPN. So just based on having Bluefish in the name, they get added to that profile. So we go through here and we see able to modify. So we see that their email address in there. And so they get added to that. So now we go to the portal and check the group assignments. So Cody Bluefish, membership of dynamic. So now the attacker has access to the test dynamic group. So now they've got access to this group, and they were able to exploit that just by using an email address with that Bluefish within there. So to summarize, the attacker starts with global reader in Azure AD. The attacker finds a dynamic group within the VM contributor role. Membership is dynamic based on the Bluefish existing in the UPN. So they use that Gmail account. The attacker can invite guests per the default. So the attacker just invites themselves. So the attacker invites the guest Gmail account with Bluefish in the address. And so it's added. And the guest account triggers the dynamic group after accessing inherits the VM contributor role in Azure roles-based access control. So notes on dynamic group abuse. In this example, we showed you how dynamic groups based on UPN can be abused using a guest account. However, there are many other attributes determining dynamic group membership, and different types of attackers could abuse each. When setting up dynamic groups, consider whether lower level privileged users or external attackers could modify the attributes and define the group. The following are other potential attack paths to modify user attributes. So the AD connect sync, an attacker can modify user attributes and in an on-premises system, and Azure AD Connect would connect and sync those attributes up to the cloud. Access to other administrative accounts in Azure AD. Some Azure AD administrative roles would allow an attacker to modify other user attributes. This would require a pre-compromised administrative account. So as we kind of mentioned, the assume breach model kind of plays in there, and automated custom creation of Azure AD accounts with user defined attributes. So pretty interesting. That's the things we have to run into, that we run into where there's any kind of automation of processes. If they're not really secure, then someone can find a way to abuse those. And so let me share that link, and I will make sure that it's in the panels this time. Yeah, Michael shared, I mentioned it yesterday, you need admin role, but DC Sync and DC Connect are awesome hacks. Yeah, I know DC Sync is really good, especially even just from legacy Active Directory. You can do some pretty cool stuff with that. So I shared that last link, and I'll go ahead and share this one coming up of this next resource that we'll be covering here. So this next one is on abusing managed identities. So Azure privilege escalation using managed identities. So Azure, this is, if you really want to follow a good resource on pen testing related information, netspy.com, that I posted that last link from. These guys write some really cool tools, and they have some really good blog posts. Some of the people on their team have written some really good Burp Suite plugins too, some extensions that work pretty well. So this is a good company to follow. A lot of good information there. So Azure managed identities are Azure AD objects that allow Azure virtual machines to act as users in an Azure subscription. While this may sound like a bad idea, AWS utilizes AIM instance profiles for EC2 and Lambda execution roles to accomplish very similar results. So it's not uncommon practice across cloud providers, and in the author's experience, they're not as commonly used as AWS EC2 controls, but Azure managed identities may be potential option for privilege escalation. So this is one of the things when you're learning the different types of cloud security and cloud pen testing is, as they're mentioning here, these managed identities are similar to what they do in AWS. So I would always almost imagine that if they don't, then it'd be probably safe to say that there's maybe something similar in Google Cloud or some other cloud providers. So as you learn these, you can kind of map the techniques to other areas. So you find a really cool way to exploit something, then maybe there's a way to exploit similar attributes on other cloud infrastructure. So managed identities on Azure VMs can given excessive Azure permissions. Access to these VMs could lead to privilege escalation. So much like other Azure AD objects, these managed entities can be granted IAM permissions for specific resources in the subscription. So like your storage accounts and database, et cetera, or they can be given subscriptions level permissions, reader, contributor, owner. If the identity is given a role or privileges higher than granted to the users with access to VM, users could be able to escalate privileges from the virtual machine. Yeah, that's my good point, Michael. A lot of people, they name it something else, because they got to brand it themselves. Sometimes and you can understand why they do that, especially the people that originally come out with the technology. Sometimes if there was more universal naming, it would be easier to learn the products, but I don't think, they're really worried about that. So anyone with command execution rights to a virtual machine that has managed identity can execute commands as that managed identity from the VM. So here are some potential scenarios that could result in command execution rights on Azure VM. So local domain, local users, RDP, PS remoting, et cetera, application issues resulting in command execution, patch-related issues resulting in command execution. So this is kind of a common thing across all sorts of platforms, systems being unpatched. Azure IAM contributor permissions on VM, thick applications breakout. So this is even like some of the breakouts through Citrix and those sort of things, and even like some of your containerization like Docker or other areas that you can break out. So identifying managed identities. In the Azure portal, there are a couple different places where you will be able to identify managed identities. The first option is the virtual machine section. Under each VM, there will be an identity tab that will show us the status of the VM's managed identity. So here we show enable. So it shows right here, enable system assigned managed identity. So they're enabling that. Alternatively, you'll be able to manage identities in any access control IAM tabs where a managed identity has rights. In this example, MGI test identity has owner rights on the resource in question, a subscription. So here we see the resource from the Azure CLI, Azure AD user. So to identify managed identities as authenticated Azure AD user in the CLI or command line, I normally get a list of VMs and pipe that into a command showing the identity. So here's the one-liner that the author uses for that to identify managed solutions. So here's the one-liner. So I sent this article out. So you want to bookmark that. So the nice thing about this article, you can actually copy it from. They get it made easily to copy that syntax. So since the principal a GUID isn't the easiest thing to identify the specific managed identity, I print the VM name first to help figure out which VM MGI test owns the identity. So here they ran here's the output. Zoom this in a little bit more. See if you can see that. So here they run the test. And so you can see the tenant ID, the principal ID listed there, the type, system assigned. So from the Azure CLI on the VM, let's assume that you have a session RDP or PS remoting on the Azure VM, and you want to check if the VM has managed identity. If the Azure CLI is installed, you can use the AZ login identity command to authenticate as the VM to the CLI. If this is successful, you have confirmed that you have access to a managed identity. Okay, let me see. I sure thought I copied and pasted that in there because I posted a couple different bookmarks or URLs. I kind of put those in there together, but I reposted it there. I made sure that I got it going to attendees too. I don't know how that happened the first time. And so installed, you can see the AZ login identity command to authenticate as a VM to the CLI. If successful, you have confirmed that you have access to a managed identity. From here, your best bet is to list your permissions for the current subscription. So here is the syntax for that. Alternatively, you can enumerate through those resources and the subscription and check your rights on those IDs, resource groups, etc. So that's the interesting thing about PowerShell, how powerful the things you can do with that. And then so amazing how they really upgraded the command line, because for so many years, that was one of the strengths to Linux, was the fact all these things you could do with Bash. And then with PowerShell, it's just amazing how they've really upped their game. I mean, back in the old DOS days, you really couldn't do a whole lot from the command line, but the way they really evolved the Windows operating system and Active Directory and PowerShell has been pretty amazing. So Michael says Enum for Linux works with cloud as well. Oh, okay, thanks for sharing that, Michael. I didn't realize that it did anything for cloud. So you guys need to make sure to follow Michael on Twitter and LinkedIn. This guy's got some great resources. This dude puts in a lot of studying. So if you see his LinkedIn, all these different courses he's taking and certifications he's getting. So back to the old commercial with Michael Jordan. I want to be like Mike. So that. So from Azure Metadata Service, if you don't have Azure CLI on the VM, yep, you have access to, you can still use PowerShell to make calls to Azure AD OAuth token service to get tokens to use with Azure REST APIs. While it's not as handy as Azure CLI, it may be your only option. So to do this, invoke a web request for the OAuth API with the following command. So they're invoking web request to get these tokens. If it returns an actual token, then you can have a managed identity to work with. This token can be used with REST APIs to take actions in Azure. A simple proof of concept for this included the demo section below. Okay, so here's the actual proof of concept code for that. Okay, and they've got a video too on one of a talk they did at UrbanCon there. So you can think of this method similar to gathering AWS credentials from the metadata service from EC2 host. Plenty has been written on that subject. So there's a good primer for further reading on it. So this is good. It's got some, some other references to AWS. So as you're learning the whole cloud thing, you're able to go back and forth and just kind of reference some of the exploits there. If you can find certain types of exploits for one cloud provider, then you could possibly do research and find similar attacks on the others. So yeah, I bet Mike doesn't sleep much. I remember early on in my even prior to pen testing, just learning different things along the way and just kind of showing how education is important overall. Back in my IT days, I used to do web design as kind of a side business. And I used to I had my own web server at home back then. The ISP I was using, they gave me 5 static IP addresses. So I had Apache web server running. I had SendMail set up with SMTP relay so I could relay customers' emails to them, and did all the web hosting there. So just learning how Apache worked once I moved into security, and then pen testing, having an idea how Apache works, made my life easier as a pen tester. So anytime you're learning any of this stuff, I can't go back and emphasize anymore how helpful it is to anything you learn, that you're able to apply it to other areas. So Michael, when do you take that exam? I guess you're also taking a second Azure exam. Actually, for speaking of Joseph, Joseph and Omar asked me to participate in a couple of things they're doing through the Red Team Village for the RSA conference next month. So some other areas that can be abused in Active Directory is like the app owner. Okay, so you're briefly looking at the AZ500 and then taking GPen next week. Okay, so the CanSecCon, I totally missed seeing anything about that. That's good. And this is a good example here. I know Lily and Don on here, they do a lot with conferences and volunteer for different villages and stuff. Mike on here does a lot of stuff for the Red Team Village, and that's a good way to get in the community and make connections, because once you make good connections with these different villages and different conferences, it makes it a lot easier to get to come back and speak and do workshops and stuff like that. So one of the things I really work on is, building good relationships with the different conferences. Really helpful in your career too, because, they know if someone is looking for a specific type of role, then it's a good chance that you would be referred for those type of roles too. So is there a corresponding Blue Team Village? Yes, there is. Yeah, I'm trying to think. The Blue Team Village at DEF CON, I think may have came out the same year or either the year before the Red Team Village. So yeah, there's a corresponding Blue Team Village. There's like an IoT village. There's a social engineering village. Chris Hadnagy is the one who kind of oversees the social engineering village, and then the IoT village. Don participates in that a lot. We're a sponsor for the IoT village. So yeah, there's a lot of different villages. I mean, it's interesting the things they're getting into. Some of the IoT stuff, like at DEF CON, they'd added like a maritime village, so related to ships and stuff, security on ships. So they really gotten into some really amazing stuff because, they realized that some of these areas are kind of, vulnerable, and the more people you bring into a certain area, the more people you have thinking about security, then there's a better chance of actually improving the security of those things. Because just like even when you look at bug hunting, the more people you get into car hacking, the more likely you are to find bugs and be able to prevent it, because, the bad guys aren't always sharing their exploits in the car hacking. Yeah, Don shared some good ones there too. Hardware hacking village, lock picking village, and car hacking village. Yeah, and they did have a couple years, not sure if it's still occurring, but they used to have the voter hacking village too. The vote, yeah, Don mentioned at the end. Yeah, the voting machine village. That's been pretty interesting to follow, and a very hot topic over recent years because of the elections and stuff. Yeah, I saw that, the satellite hacking. That's pretty cool. So with all the hardware and stuff, they can have a medical device hacking village. Back in my consulting career, I did a Wi-Fi pen test for a couple hospital chains, and it's pretty interesting to see medical devices that are hooked up to Wi-Fi networks in these hospitals. So that's pretty interesting. And actually, around the same time frame, working for right before I got out of consulting, I actually did a pen test for a company that made medical devices. While their medical devices weren't in scope, it was pretty interesting that how you could see those devices connected to their network, which is kind of scary when you think about that stuff. And before doing those Wi-Fi pen tests in those hospitals, that was kind of scary as well, just to see that stuff is connected to the network, and that something actually accidentally went down, you could be in some big trouble. So is anyone else? I know Michael has. Anyone else here gone through the Azure content? Okay, Don shared the Blue Team conference, and these are good things. These are good places to volunteer. And usually go to any of those sites for the conference. They have a call for volunteers. And the thing is, it doesn't matter what your level is. They've got some place for volunteers. And a lot of cases you can get trained on the different stations within those villages. And another one is pretty fun is the Wi-Fi hacking, or the wireless hacking village is pretty interesting. They usually do some good talks on Wi-Fi pen testing related stuff. So that's pretty cool.